Welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool, and with you at PTV WORLD, I will bring you stories from around the world and of course include analysts and experts on the show as well to discuss them in further detail and of course give you a little more than what the news may be covering. We will be taking a look at two important stories in this show today. One, of course, is in relation to the evolving situation in Afghanistan, where we have seen that the US envoy on Afghanistan is going to be returning to Doha once again for engagement with the Taliban representatives. We've seen that he was also part of the Troika Plus that was held earlier, hosted by Pakistan. And of course, these engagements seem to be increasing in frequency now. We've seen that the international community does want to engage and keep engaged with the Taliban regime, even if there is no formal recognition of the government as of yet. But we still know that the international community does understand the fact that the Taliban regime is not something they can ignore. It is there, and it is they are the ones that they will have to interact with for any sort of situation to come out in terms of peace in Afghanistan. Of course, we know that there is a serious humanitarian and economic crisis looming in Afghanistan, and we all want to avert that because, of course, peace in Afghanistan will translate into peace in the region and other areas of the world. How much this is going to impact in terms of the actual relations between countries in Afghanistan, their strategies, and of course the Taliban side and their commitments that they are going to uphold or not is what we're going to be discussing in further detail today. We will also be taking a look at the situation in Poland and of course the migration politics that we've seen. We saw such a crisis back in 2015 and 16, but now on the Polish and Belarusian border, we've seen that there is, of course, another crisis that is emerging, which is stirring up the debate that was earlier discussed a couple of years ago as well in terms of migration politics, what the countries in the world need to be doing with this regard, what sort of strategies are okay, what are not. Are we going to continue to build walls? We're going to continue to look at national interests or actually look at the humanitarian crisis right at our doorsteps. What the political scenario of the different countries is in this evolving situation, and what really can be done about it. So we'll discuss this at length as well. Let's start off with, of course, the situation in Afghanistan. For this, as always, we have Mr. Farrukh Pitafi and Mr. Faisal with us in the studio. Thank you for joining us. And we also have Tariq Farhadi, who's an Afghan affairs expert, and Mr. Asif Durrani, who's a former ambassador. Thank you once again for joining us on the debate. Mr. Farhadi, I'll start with you. Considering the fact that we have seen and discussed the Afghan situation multiple times now, we've seen that since the Taliban takeover, the engagement with the Taliban regime by different members of the international community continues to increase, particularly the United States as well. As the next step comes into play with the US representative to Afghanistan also engaging once again in Doha after meetings in Pakistan as well, including Troika Plus, and earlier engagements with the Taliban regime, how do you see the US's efforts in terms of moving towards a situation where we can see that the humanitarian and economic situation of Afghanistan can be improved? And then, of course, moving towards a place where the Taliban regime can then be officially recognized.
Greetings to you and the guests and dear viewers. The US has come under a lot of pressure from the Europeans that essentially by leaving the way it left, the peace negotiations did not go anywhere, and now we have a government in Kabul with members of Taliban who have sanctions on them, and consequently the US is not going to recognize this government, and it has cut off the country from the international financial system. It has frozen its reserves, and the Europeans, who are mostly the ones who could suffer from the projection of the crisis in the form of refugees. You have talked about Belarus in this program. Afghanistan is part of that tragedy. The Europeans are, so to speak, telling the US, you sort of broke it, but you left without fixing it. So that's why the US feels a responsibility to come back and engage with the Taliban and put conditionalities in order to recognize the Taliban in the future, but it has to become step by step, and the Taliban have to make some changes in Kabul in order for the US to be able to recognize this regime. And the changes in Kabul are painful in nature for the Taliban to make. Maybe they will not be able to make it, maybe they will be, but at least the US is telling them what we are telling them through interviews, what we feel they should be doing in the way of changes.
Right. We also understand, Mr. Farhadi, that as we speak about the fact that the US may have a larger share of the responsibility in terms of the situation in Afghanistan, can we say with full confidence that the moral ground that we're speaking of is a driving force enough for any state or for the US to actually play its part?
Well, you see, the Europeans are playing their part because they have been paying development assistance to Afghanistan all these years. And now that the US has left, they are still paying. I mean, 600 million euros will come from Germany. And every time there is a demand for pledge, the Europeans are paying because the Europeans are likely to receive the wave of refugees through different channels. The legal refugees, the illegal refugees, those who arrive in Greece, those who arrive in Kosovo, those who arrive in Belarus. So the Europeans are left with the tab. Like if you are going to a restaurant, someone tells you, let's go to the restaurant tonight, and the person who had invited you leaves earlier than everyone else, and you, before leaving the restaurant, you have to pay the restaurant bill. This is how the Europeans feel about Afghanistan and what the US has done.
Right. Quite a fair analogy that you have given us over the year. But of course, the different countries in the world share their own perspectives and national interests. We'll move on to Mr. Asif Durrani. Thank you for joining us on the debate, sir. You've joined us on telephone line. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for having me.
Right. Considering the fact that, of course, we've seen the European states have their own sort of approach with regards to Afghanistan and putting a lot of pressure on the United States, and then the US now increasing its engagement, can we say that perhaps the European states have a different plan in terms of interacting with the regime in Afghanistan than maybe the US?
I don't think so. I think they are partners. They have been partners when the American-led coalition was in Afghanistan. They came together, they left together, most of the countries. So in that respect, I think, but there may be some differences in strategies. United States being the superpower, the hyperpower, perhaps may have different axe to grind, and they have different motives. And for the Europeans, actually, for those which are called caveat nations are those nations which refused to take military action while they were in Afghanistan. Those nations which were fighting in Afghanistan were United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and to some extent Netherlands. The other nations, especially France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, they were known as caveat nations. They were there in Afghanistan, but they were actually holding the fort while the offensive were launched by those offensive nations I have just mentioned. So now the European nations have realized that once the United States left, and it left on the 30th of August, it has caused a great calamity. If you now the statistics are showing that alarmingly 90% of Afghans are actually suffering from poverty, and their per day income has plummeted to $1.9 per person, and it is likely to plummet further to half. If that is the case, then we are talking about abject poverty. Then we are talking about a famine-like situation in Afghanistan. We are talking about 38 million people in Afghanistan, half of which would be actually starving. And then only the 5% of 38 million people will have only adequate food or to feed their families. The others are going to suffer, and they have to suffer badly. So in that respect, those, yes.
Mr. Asif, does this mean that perhaps other players can emerge as more important stakeholders in the evolving situation in Afghanistan, and their role with regards to the regime in Afghanistan will be more important than perhaps the United States, countries like China or Russia?
I think we just cannot make a comparison or bring those nations into competition. The issue is that you have to make all the nations realize that there is a catastrophe which is visiting Afghanistan, and that needs to be addressed. And the dire need is that those people who have no fault, they were not Taliban, they were not from any ethnic group or religious group which may have fought the Americans. They came to Afghanistan, of course, under the UN Security Council resolutions, but at the same time, it is their responsibility to look after the people, because for the past 20 years, those Americans and their coalition partners, they were calling the shots. And what they have left Afghanistan in a quandary, because now coffers are empty. Banks are unable to deal. If banks are unable to deal, how this country is going to run, how this country is going to import or export. So these are the stark questions which need immediate answers, because even delay of 1 week would cost so many lives. And
absolutely. Of course, the situation requires
Mr. Farhadi
urgent attention from the international community. We'll continue our discussion with a short report to play, and then we'll carry on.
Afghanistan, Thomas West will be in Doha next week for a 2-day visit to conduct talks with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. According to State Department spokesperson Ned Price, matters of vital US national interest in Afghanistan will be discussed, which include engaging with the international community in aiding Afghanistan, financial assistance, and security. The rising challenge of ISKP and Al-Qaeda is a source of concern for the US administration. According to a statement by the Foreign Ministry, an Islamic Emirate delegation led by Acting Foreign Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi will hold talks with the US and the EU delegations in Doha from November 27th to 29th on the release of bank assets, humanitarian aid, education, public health, and the reopening and security of embassies in Kabul.
The situation, of course, is quite dire in Afghanistan, and it requires urgent attention. As we were speaking earlier, there is a humanitarian and economic crisis looming in Afghanistan. And of course, politics aside, this is something that needs to be addressed urgently. Faisal, you had a question for our guest, Farhadi.
Yeah, Sana, I had a question from Dr. Farhadi, but before that, I just want to lay the foundations for the question. According to my understanding, right now what we're seeing is in Doha, Doha could be considered as a de facto Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Afghanistan right now. And if in coming days we might see that European Union countries and Americans, they will be talking to Taliban a lot in there. But there's one very one aspect which was highlighted by Dr. Farhadi about of course the European countries, they have a lot of pressure in terms of refugee influx which they are facing. But there is another thing I wanted to ask him about. Could we say that in coming days, if European Union or if European countries one by one they talk to Taliban, then that could be for the reason as Taliban are fighting against ISIS Khorasan, and ISIS Khorasan is being considered as a ground, a training ground for Daesh or ISIS. And of course, European countries, they have concerns related to Daesh and ISIS Khorasan. So if they are fighting against ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan, then of course European countries, they will be intact with Taliban to counter that threat as well. What do you think, sir?
Sir, this is a very good question. The European countries have their own problems with ISIS Khorasan in the form that when there is spasms of discomfort far away in the world, the translation of it is mini micro attacks in the streets of European countries, of someone who comes out with a knife and kills or wounds people. And it's all a generation of young people in Europe that follow basically what's happening in these far-fetched territories for them, and they misinterpret it, and they are victim to a lot of propaganda as well. So the European countries know that they have to subdue a little bit this virulence, I would say, of feelings. An example in Pakistan was this story of French embassy had to be closed because of the Charlie Hebdo caricatures, etc. The world is now connected through the internet, and yes, if the Taliban can reduce the risk of ISIS-K and all this indoctrination, it would be better for the Europeans. I'm not sure the Taliban are willing or can do that. It is beyond the Taliban. It's a phenomenon that has grown beyond one territory or one type of extremist movement that we see in our region. We see it in Nigeria as well, in other places, in Mali as well. So the Europeans are, the method has not been invented on how to subdue this kind of feeling that I would say translates inside the territory of Europe into other young people taking initiatives on lone terrorism activities. The answer has not been invented, and it's not sure that the Taliban really can fix that for the Europeans. And each European country has a different appreciation of what's going on. The Polands and Hungaries of the world who are at the border are really worried about the refugees, because the laws in Europe require them to give them asylum as they arrive in the first European country where they set foot. And then in other countries, there are differences of appreciation of the refugees. For Europe, definitely, all the problems of the world knock on the door of the Europe, and the United States is one Atlantic away.
Absolutely, and that is one important issue that we will be discussing in further detail in the later part of the show. Farrukh, considering the fact that we have seen that the West or the United States or the European countries want certain things from the Taliban regime. Right. And they boil down to a few that we have discussed in further detail, including inclusive government, as safe territory in terms of Afghanistan, so not being used against any other nation, and of course then other issues like rights to women and human rights situation, all of that. If we look at all of this, how does this actually boil down in terms of any guarantees that the Taliban regime can give? Okay, we can say that this is what we want from the Taliban regime, but in terms of actual actions or steps, what will be that line or that assurance for the West or the United States that, okay, now the Taliban are fulfilling their commitments and we can move to the next step?
And that is a very good question. Let me remind you that when it comes to Afghanistan, we have been concerned for quite some time. But now it seems, given that in Afghanistan, reality is crashing for most of the citizens, and the tragedies upon tragedies we continue to see, let me tell you that I feel stumped. I don't know how to resolve this gridlock. Why do I say this? Because the West and the Western powers or international powers have their expectations. And of course, the Taliban have made commitment in the past at Doha. And last time when Amir Muttaqi Sahab was here in Pakistan, he actually ensured that they are complying with the Doha agreement, right? That was news to many of us, because we thought that Doha agreement is over or process is over. But he said that they are going to cooperate with that. Now, at this moment, it seems that given the kind of contradictions that there are within Afghanistan, and there might be some kind of pressure groups within the Taliban themselves, they are failing to deliver on those promises. Taliban cannot deliver on certain promises like human rights, women rights, mainstreaming, and including other opponent groups, right? Regarding terrorism, they can ensure that their land is not used against any country. In the past, all these organizations, may it be IMU, may it be TTP, may it be ETIM, they have been associates of Taliban, right? So today, when they promise that they are going to attack them and to reduce their operations, that means automatically these groups go and join ISKP, right? And that is exactly what seems to be happening right now. But in this situation, I don't understand how the world and Afghan Taliban are going to bridge their differences. The question so far is that we keep on saying what is the moral imperative for the West, for the powers or their richer nations. The question right now for me is what is the moral imperative for Afghan Taliban? The fact remains that they are government at this moment, de facto government, and they owe a lot to their people. So including women, including or ensuring that kids, girls, actually go to school, shouldn't be that big a concession? Or human rights, or including opposition parties into their governments, their government. At this moment, I think we keep on asking what the West can do. And I assure you, I believe that the West should be doing a lot, but Afghan Taliban need to actually do a lot as well. And this is a kind of question to your other guests as well. Why is it that we are not working, or the countries that are associated or they are neighboring Afghanistan are not convincing the Afghan Taliban to make these concessions as quickly as possible? People are selling their children right now.
Absolutely. Mr. Asif, would you like to respond to that?
Durrani sir.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, can you come back with the question? Sorry.
The question is simple enough. Why cannot we ignore the fact that we really need to work towards resolving the humanitarian crisis and not move towards the fact that we need to be able to actually help and help the people of Afghanistan, and for that what can the Taliban regime actually do to step up?
May I rephrase that as well? Ambassador sir, my question was simple. We keep on saying that the Western powers or richer nations need to do this, this and that. There are many governments and they are going to have their own standards, right? But why can't we actually convince the government in Kabul to actually make those concessions regarding human rights? Because that way it will become really easy to recognize the government and also to actually supply with all the financial aid and support.
Farrukh and Sana, you have hit the nail in the head. The question is that it is a real politics. Everyone knows what is to be done. And that is why no recognition to Taliban, because reason is that it's a chicken game. The immediate neighbors of Afghanistan are looking at the U.S., and the U.S. is looking at the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, especially China and Russia and Pakistan, that how they first recognize. So this is one aspect. Second is that when you talk about the humanitarian aid and assistance, it is there, but it is coming in trickles. And the question is, but the need is is humongous. The need is so big, but whatever they are giving it in piecemeal. And that is not enough. And that is actually adding frustration in Afghanistan. My worry is that if this situation continues unabated, then probably the Afghan people would be forced, those who would be deprived of necessary food or shelter, they would be forced to migrate to the neighboring countries, especially Pakistan and Iran. So this is another crisis. That is why when initially Sana put the question about differences in Western Europe's or Europe's approach and the United States, the Europeans are worried that if mass exodus starts in Pakistan or Iran, it would not stop to Pakistan or Iran. It is going to end up in European countries. 2015, when the Syrian crisis started, it was just not the Syrians who migrated en masse. It was a proportion of a biblical proportion, but the Afghans even close to almost 200,000 Afghans also migrated to Europe, especially in Germany. Germany had to take almost 1 million refugees. So it's the biggest issue. And that is also creating socio-economic problems in those countries where these refugees have taken shelter. And if you may have seen it recently on this Belarus versus Poland, the crisis has erupted. Mostly those are Syrians and those are Kurds, and those are being blocked. They are not allowed entry into Poland. So the same crisis can, with bigger proportions, can come to the European doors, European borders, and that is actually very serious. And it is also serious for us, for Pakistan, for Iran, and immediate other neighbors of Afghanistan. But mostly it would be Pakistan and Iran who would suffer. Yes.
And that, of course, is an important issue. And the crisis that you earlier mentioned regarding European nations is, of course, very important. And it's something that we are going to be discussing in further detail as well, specifically with regards to Poland and Belarus. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Farrukh and Mr. Asif Durrani, for being with us on the debate. We'll now move on to, of course, the situation in Europe, as we were discussing earlier as well in relation to Afghanistan. We've seen a crisis regarding migration in Europe back in 2015 and 16. A lot of debate spurred around as to what needs to be done regarding that. Different people have different opinions as to how to deal with such a crisis, whether or not the migrants influx need to be allowed in based on humanitarian ground, what sort of precedence does national interest take over in this regard, and what policies and laws need to be kept in place, and whether or not they should be changed. What is happening right now at the Poland and Belarusian border is that we have thousands of people stuck there, and they're facing extreme weather conditions, a military standoff, and then, of course, migration politics are also involved, where the President Alexander Lukashenko is being blamed for this crisis, giving disinformation to the people and bringing them to the border in retaliation of sanctions that is earlier experienced by the European Union. This, of course, is a situation at the moment. We'll take a closer look at it, and we will also be joined by our expert on the show, Dr. Shahid Qureshi, who's a senior analyst at the London Post. As soon as he joins us, he's going to be part of the discussion as well. Before we move on, Faisal, I'd like to start with you. Considering what we've seen so far, what is happening at the border, a lot of it revolves around discussions as to what is the right way to deal with such a crisis. And we've seen this talk of building walls, whether or not that is the right way to go forward. Should we be going towards that direction? Considering this fact and the refugee influx we've seen in the past, do you think that the European nations, irrespective of their own political interests at the moment, are heading in the right direction?
Not at all. To me, I think, Sana, it is so heartening to see whatever is going on that border. Of course, from the Belarus side, I was just going through one report. I think it was yesterday's report of Human Rights Watch. They have mentioned everything in details and how many people they have died so far. 13 people they are mentioning that they have died so far. And look at the temperatures. Maximum temperature that goes there, it's 2, and the minimum it goes to -4. And these sub-zero temperatures, we're talking about sub-zero temperatures, and humans are they are not allowed to get in the cities. In Belarus, I'm talking, there's this city, Brest, which is very next to the border. The majority of the 3,000 to 4,000 people, the refugees who are in the jungles, they are living in dire conditions. Of course, there are few organizations, NGOs, and few generous people from Belarus side. They are trying to help them. Then, of course, I was reading that few of the lawyers, they are trying they're really hard to get them people adjusted somewhere, because there are dire conditions right now on that border. But end of the day, it's just the political situation getting odd in there, and that's why they're not accepting these people in there. At the same time, Sana, I was going through different I just put phrases to look for a settlement case or something like how to get a settlement in the European countries. Then they have very hunky-dory type of packages over there, that if you invest in our country, we'll give you settlement, we'll give you residence card, and if you are bringing this much amount. So they are attracting the people with the money, not people that, the ones who are trying to safeguard themselves or trying to secure themselves.
Okay.
And here we have a European Union that is allowing anyone with the money, what sort of money they have, whatever the money they have. We know that our own former Prime Minister, he has allegations on himself that he took the illicit money transported from here to Britain, and he's enjoying himself in there. There are so many examples that the corrupt people of poorer countries, they are living there. Same was the case with the Afghan previous government as well. There were so many of them who actually laundered the illicit money from Afghanistan, from Pakistan as well, and what they are doing with that money, they are investing in the Western countries, because Western countries, they are allowing to invest that money in
Faisal,
there.
we'll talk more about this. We'll go to a short report, and we'll be back and continue the discussion.
The refugee crisis at the Poland-Belarus border has become a nightmare. The crisis began as a large number of asylum seekers, mostly from Iraq, turned to the Belarus-Poland border to enter Europe in search of a life better than their conflict-ridden nations. However, Poland pushed them back and resisted the entry of the migrants. The refugees are now stranded in sub-zero weather and in poor condition. The Polish government perceives it as a move by the Belarusian government to disrupt peace of the 27 nations European Union. The refugees stranded in the frigid temperatures include women and children. For these individuals escaping conflict in their own countries, the nightmare never seems to end.
And we're back once again. We'll try and play that report once again. We seem to be experiencing a technical issue. Apologies for that. Considering the movement that we've been discussing before and the situation at the Poland-Belarusian border, it brings up a lot of talk regarding what needs to be done about it. We've seen countries proposing a change in the EU migration policies to move towards pushback in terms of any emergent situation in a country. We have Poland and Lithuania declaring states of emergency, and they want to be able to utilize such policies in order to face the situation. Farrukh, we understand that, of course, national interest reigns supreme, and it's important for different countries to protect themselves. But when we're faced with such humanitarian crisis, can these states get away with just declaring states of emergency and sort of justifying whatever measures they seem to be taking at the moment?
The very quick answer to your question is no, they can't. But let me ask you that there is a short version to the answer and there is a long version. Which one do you want?
I want the medium version.
Medium version.
Okay, but the problem is that there are many nuances that you'll have to realize. First of all, you'll have to meet the cast of characters. Alexei Lukashenko is the president of Belarus, and he is notorious for something which happened very recently, and that was he actually diverted a plane on which there was a gentleman who was a journalist and a critic of his government, and it was diverted in the name of terrorism, fighting terrorism. So there has been this very interesting character. Then, of course, is the Polish government, which seems to be failing not only in anti-immigrant sentiment, but also anti-Semitic sentiment that is going on in Poland because of history. This is one thing. But then there are terminologies which are very important, and you'll have to hear them. One is Fortress Europe, that actually emerged out of the bedlam that we saw in 2014-15 crisis, that was refugee crisis. Then there is a term called the Great Replacement Theory. It is a conspiracy theory that the white race is being replaced by the Arabs or people from Middle East or Africa, right? This has been actually supported by certain anti-reactionary elements. And then there is this idea of clash of civilizations that I keep on talking about. Now, what is happening is that today, Karl Marx once said that history first repeats itself as a tragedy and then as a farce. At this moment, it seems that we are going through the tragic bit of it. My attention actually came to this issue when former President Donald Trump actually sent his envoy to the place and actually pointed out that there is something simmering. And why would he do that? If you remember what was happening in Greece, it seemed that from Arab Spring, after that economic crisis in Greece, and then the refugee crisis, a kind of sentiment was being pushed in the West. And that's why you saw Brexit, you saw far right rising, and then Donald Trump actually coming to power. Something similar seems to be happening. It is the Lukashenko government is accused that it went to the Iraq, and then actually lured people to Belarus that we are going to actually give you a better life here.
Right.
And that's why people came here. Then they were told that you can go to Germany through Poland. And because Poland is going to actually push back, this situation keeps on simmering. So this is the medium answer. I have more to add, but let us first go to your other guests.
Yes, we welcome Dr. Shahid Qureshi, who's a senior analyst at the London Post. Thank you very much for joining us and being part of the debate. We're, of course, discussing the situation at the Poland-Belarusian border and the overall migration politics that we've seen in Europe and the refugee crisis that we saw in the past. Do you think that anything similar may seem to be emerging out of the situation right now? Something that is quite similar to what we've seen in the past is, of course, whenever there is such a crisis at the borders, we've seen that the European nations move towards stricter law enforcement, pushbacks, and then, of course, blocking of NGOs or other organizations to actually come forward and assist them. There are, in fact, laws that will create problems for the people who want to assist these refugees. They can face up to 4 years in prison, and of course, there are other consequences as well. This seems to be what the European nations have deployed in the past and are continuing to do so today. Can we say that if this is something that they can justify in terms of their national interest, the NGOs and different organizations who want to come forward can actually be prevented from stepping in? Is this not a question, irrespective of who may be to blame for the situation, is something that is a responsible state must be doing?
Well, it's a very long answer in parts. What
there seems to be a problem in your audio, Mr. Shahid. Perhaps you can.
Right, Shahzad, we can hear you, but you stop actually. Can you continue speaking? Because we can't seem to actually get what you're saying.
I'll try if you can hear me.
Yeah.
There is a
difference.
Yes. There is a difference between them and the refugee. Some elements in media, especially in Western media, very cleverly mix them together, and you are doing the same thing in your program. Refugees are protected under the UN Charter, and any country which is pushing the refugees or treating them badly, they are in violation of the UN Charter. That's one thing. What's happening in Belarusia border? Most of the refugees who came from Libya, from Syria, from Iraq, and these are the countries which are attacked by the Western nations, i.e. NATO, in last 20 years. And these are the product of their bombings and attacks. What needs to be, and also at the same time, their government, the current government in Iraq, for example, and in Syria and in Libya, they are corrupt, and the people are leaving. People are selling their cars, their homes, and going somewhere else where they feel more safe. There's one more thing which I wrote about a few years ago, and people like yourselves must know about it. Is there is a policy adopted by the uh, I will just use the word foreign nations or some evil nations to keep the Muslim countries in turmoil and keep them in the move. And so what we see in 1979, we see 4 million refugees coming into Pakistan and burdening for the last 40 years. And we see same thing in last 10 years in Turkey. We see 4 million Syrian refugees coming in and burdening and the European Union promised Turkey that they will give them financial aid if Turkey stop them and don't let them come to Europe. But having said that, these are the Muslim lands where all these bombings and attacks are happening, and refugees are moving from Somalia to Sudan, and Sudan to Ethiopia, and Ethiopia to Eritrea. So all this young movement, and in Pakistan, in your case, for example, uh, you had about 3 million IDPs, internally displaced people, and you have a younger population. And when you move, when anybody move a house, that create a turmoil in the whole thing. People are in terms of education, in terms of their healthy development, in terms of there are a lot of issues, social issues, financial issues are created, and they're all linked with the European interventions in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq. And what we see now uh, is the colonial powers who've been colonizing the whole world. I mean, for example, the United Kingdom has been colonized 90%, 95% of the world. And now they are complaining about refugees. I mean, we have a home secretary here who was a Priti Patel. She was a disaster. She was sacked in the previous government for a misconduct. And we got 27 or more people got killed in the channel between France and the UK, as you know, last night, which was a disaster. Uh, we are Britain is a country which is creating a lot of intervention approach in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We're going around and bombing all these countries. And when these people, desperate people, when they are leaving their homes, when they're coming down here, instead of welcoming them or instead of being supportive of them, we're blaming them. So it's like you are blaming your victim that why are you there? And that is something which needs to be raised by the leadership. For example, the
Right.
Pakistani leadership needs to raise this issue with the UNHCR. But in last 40
Right.
years, they've been very quietly every year signing agreement that they're going to keep the Afghan refugees in their country.
Right, Dr. Shad, we're almost out of time. My last question to you would be the European nations have come under a lot of criticism in the past as well as to how they've handled the refugee crisis earlier, saying that a lot of preventive measures could have been taken and they were not taken, and many leaders chose not to take them. And then, of course, we have political involvements like what Alexander Lukashenko is being blamed to be indulging in. Do you think that the European nations and their leaders can prevent such a crisis happening now from the situation in Poland, in Belarus, from exaggerating to where it is standing at the moment? And in fact, this is something that they're choosing not to do.
Well, what's happening in the border is linked with the Russian uh, involvement into, and the European Union or the Poland, the growth of far right movement. And this is a this is, we saw a few months ago. We saw uh, uh, 30,000 refugees were on the Greek border, Greek-Turkish border. They wanted to go to Greece. So this is something which is a message to the European Union that you are creating all these refugees. There could be things on your border, and these are the things which are very petty things. I mean, these are the 4,000, 5,000 refugees are not a big issue for these nations to
Okay.
accommodate. comparing to Pakistan and Turkey, who are hosting millions of refugees, and then Sudan and other Muslim countries. But I think the European nations have been very mean, I must say. And what
Right.
Lukashenko is doing
Thank you,
is
Dr. Shad. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. For quick comments.
Right. While we were talking about all these matters, I remembered that a term that was coined by Farid Zakaria, that was FOTA, the fear of the alternative. I think that there is this thumb. When you look at the overall number, it isn't that great. It cannot change any country's demography, right? 2,000, 3,000 people stranded on the border. But somehow there seems to be an effort to create this reaction in the West. And that's why I brought up the great replacement theory. It seems that while Germany has survived all this, one country, France, seems to be actually teetering on the brink, where Eric Zemmour is a far righter element, and he seems to be rising because of these fears, because of the fear of the Muslims coming from Muslim countries, right? So at this moment, it seems that there is going to be a lash out, and that means that Donald Trump and elements like that might be returning to power.
Faisal, one liner from you.
Very quickly, both of the segments, I would say. UNHCR needs to play a role in the second segment. I wanted to say that UNHCR needs to play its role in Belarus. And second one I wanted to talk about, which was the previous one, previous segment we were talking about. We need to put trust. We need to put trust on the system, in Taliban as well. That we need to give them time. That they can sort out their problem. And Western countries, of course, they need to trust, build trust in them as well.
Much remains to be discussed, but unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us on the debate.